Unceasing information war is one of the defining threats of our day. This conflict is already ongoing, but so far in the United States, it's largely bloodless, and so we aren't acknowledging it, despite the huge consequences hanging in the balance. It is as real as the Cold War was in the 1960s, and the stakes are staggeringly high. The legitimacy of government, the persistence of societal cohesion, even our ability to respond to the impending climate crisis. If the warm war is allowed to continue as it has, there is a very real threat of descent into illegitimate leadership and fractured, paralyzed societies. If algorithmic amplification continues to privilege the propagandists most effective at gaming the system, if combatant persona accounts continue to harass civilian voices off of platforms, and if hostile state intelligence services remain able to recruit millions of Americans into fake communities, the norms that have traditionally protected democratic societies will fail. That was written in 2018 by Renee DiResta. In a quick 3 years, we can no longer call this information war largely bloodless. Hello, and welcome back to the War of Ideas podcast. As I said in my last episode, I'm going to continue talking about tech, like social media and digital advertising, and its effects on people. And it is no coincidence that a lot of the things we see in the news these days are connected to this topic. For example, the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. So even when sticking to one topic, I can still somehow make this a news or current events podcast because of how much influence social media platforms and technology have in how people think and act. So, how did social media help cause the Capitol building assault, and what do we do so something like this doesn't happen again? Well, let's talk about the how first. This is the easy part to answer. The Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public, Graphica, and the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab all collaborated around June and July of 2020 to create the Election Integrity Partnership. This partnership led to a comprehensive report about, the election integrity. And I read the report, so I am going to use some of it to help me flesh out my argument and to help better inform the people that are listening. Because this report was co-authored by around 100 people, and they know a lot more about this than I do. So, how did this happen? Here's what I think is a nice summary from the Election Integrity Partnership. Quote, misinformation in the pre-election stage undermined confidence in mail-in voting, delegitimizing the election process and setting the stage for post-election claims that the election was stolen. For months, right-wing social media users had been fed online evidence of a rigged election, coalescing into a movement to stop the steal. Right-wing social media personalities, including individuals who have repeatedly been tied to spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories, created a website and email discussion list for the Stop the Steal supporters to mobilize. Over a month after the election, the Stop the Steal events continued to take place nationwide, some with kinetic effects including stabbings and other violence. On January 6th, the real-world effects of election-related misinformation reached fever pitch. Ali Alexander and other right-wing influencers had encouraged Trump supporters throughout the country to converge on Washington, D.C. to protest in person. That morning, the president told a crowd of supporters that this election was stolen from you, from me, from the country, and encouraged his supporters to march on the Capitol. A group of these protesters, including white supremacists and QAnon believers, violently broke into the Capitol, killing Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick. 4 others died during the riot. This series of events shows that online misinformation can engender real-life radicalization with deadly consequences. End quote. So, make no mistake, this attack on the Capitol would not have happened if the environment social media has created did not exist. The Stop the Steal hashtag was like a huge Facebook mass invite for somebody's birthday. Except one of the thousands of people sending invites and pushing the movement was the president. Trump does what a lot of us do. Look for news and opinions that we like and get comforted by it. Trump may have implanted the idea of a rigged election before anyone else, because of course he was going to do that, to have an excuse ready, but he did not create the conspiracy theories about Dominion and illegal votes, and boxes of discarded ballots, and Sharpiegate. He just applied a megaphone to them. He was and is an amplifier of false information. He throws mud at a wall and runs with what sticks the best. And even though he was spreading fake messages, he was in a position of very real power. And that real authority lent credence to his words and credence to the fake news he posted. With all his tweets accusing the election of being rigged and stolen, starting way before the election, and his Army for Trump tweets telling his supporters to go looking for rigging, he didn't just prime his audience to be receptive to false narratives of election fraud. He inspired them to produce those narratives and then echoed those false claims back to them. The word produce is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Trump would say he inspired them to find evidence, and anti-Trumpers would say he inspired them to produce not evidence, but disinformation. He is a conspirator in the mess of misinformation and disinformation, but he is also a victim of it, as he is one of the people falling for the false narratives himself. He's a great example of a person being able to gaslight himself into believing what makes him comfortable. Who made him a victim of misinformation? And not just him, I mean all of the victims. Who created the misinformation? Who spread it far and wide? Well, it's complicated. The Election Integrity Partnership says there were some bottom-up false and misleading narratives started with individuals identifying real-world or one-off incidents and posting them to social media. And then influencers and hyper-partisan media leveraged this grassroots content, assembling it into overarching narratives about fraud and disseminating it across platforms to their large audiences. There was also top-down misinformation, as opposed to bottom-up, where some claims were first made by quote-unquote blue-check Twitter influencers and political operatives on social media, where it was shared by individuals of all follower amounts. There's a nice little infographic or figure in the EIP report about this. EIP meaning the Election Integrity Partnership, which I'll refer to as EIP from now on. And in fact, the primary repeat spreaders of false and misleading narratives were verified blue-check accounts belonging to partisan media outlets, social media influencers, and political figures, including President Trump and his family. The whole foreign influence and foreign intervention from Russia and other places that are trying to subvert our democracy that we heard about in 2016, according to these experts, including Camille Francois, who is part of those experts, say that foreign influence did not have as much of an effect in the 2020 election, partly because our institutions and social media platforms were ready for it after learning what happened in 2016, and partly because people who have blue check marks on Twitter and have a lot more followers, if they're the ones doing the influencing and intervention themselves, they're going to have a lot bigger effect than a bunch of 5-follower accounts from Russia. Anyway, these repeat spreaders amplified the majority of the investigated incidents aggressively across multiple platforms. Because even if they weren't the first ones to report the story or post about it, they're mainly responsible for spreading it. In a recent article in The Atlantic, Renee DeResta wrote a detailed walkthrough of how the discarded mail found in Greenville, Wisconsin created a social media conspiracy firestorm that whittled away at the trust of the United States Postal Service and election integrity as a whole. And I think this article is a perfect example of how verified, or even if they're not verified, like high follower accounts are responsible for spreading this misinformation. And of course, high follower accounts are going to be able to spread news more easily than low follower accounts, but you would think high follower accounts would be more responsible, but they're not. So here's one story from Greenville, Wisconsin, out of many, many, many stories leading up to the election. So in September of 2020, there were 3 trays of mail discovered in a ditch in Greenville, Wisconsin. The local sheriff's office reported that the mail dump included several absentee ballots, and a local Fox affiliate reported the statement on its website, and then a national network of conservative commentators and influencers picked up the story with basically just that information and put their own spin on it. And soon after, by soon I mean apparently within hours, Jim Hoft, the founder and editor of the Gateway Pundit, which is a conservative media outlet, wrote that Democrats are stealing the 2020 election because 2 trays of U.S. mail were discovered in a ditch near Greenville, and according to local officials, the mail included mail-in ballots. And the United States Postal Service unions support Joe Biden. And after the Gateway Pundit posted this story, Charlie Kirk, who is another Twitter-verified influencer with 1.7 million followers on Twitter, reposted it to his own Twitter. and so did Breitbart. By noon the following day, more than 40,000 individual Twitter accounts had retweeted the story, reaching millions of viewers. And in the same afternoon, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany cited the Greenville ballots as evidence that mail-in voting was fraudulent. So within one day, 24 hours, this story was spouted by the White House Press Secretary on live television and seen by millions of people. So essentially, the discarded mail had been weaponized into an attack on the integrity of the U.S. voting system. And as Renee DeResta writes, the story was challenging for fact-checkers. Mail had been discovered in a ditch in rural Wisconsin. Local officials had claimed that the mail included ballots. The Postal Services Union had endorsed Biden. But the overall impression of the story created by the Gateway Pundit, that the United States Postal Service workers were part of a Democratic plot to steal the election, was false. And a few days later, after the story went viral, Wisconsin election officials clarified that the discarded mail did not include any Wisconsin ballots. But even though it only took a few days, at that point, the facts didn't matter. The outrage machine had moved on, drawing its audience's attention to other manufactured grievances. So after hearing that story, if you can remember any of the other stories, and there were many, they were all like this one. Let's look at the story out of Sonoma, California, where over 1,000 ballots were found in a dumpster, supposedly thrown away. Except, in reality, the picture of the ballots in the dumpster was actually a picture of empty envelopes, not ballots. And it was a picture from 2018. But influencers, including the Gateway Pundit, Tim Pool, and Donald Trump Jr., retweeted and quote-tweeted this story, spreading the false narrative that this was an intentional dumping of ballots with implications on the 2020 election, and reinforcing the larger narrative that mail-in voting was not secure. So just think for a moment how you are likely hearing about this for the first time from me, and that we are well more than 3 months past the election, when the inauguration has already passed and no one cares about these stories anymore. That's an outcome of the present-day news cycle. It's much easier to share misinformation or minimal information and create a story around it than it is to find out the truth behind a story and cover all your bases before releasing the story. And not only that, the stories behind misinformation are likely going to be a lot more sensationalistic than real stories. So they have a leg up in two big ways. Number one is they can produce their fake narratives with minimal information well before and a lot easier than a robust investigative journalism piece that finds out the truth and gets down in the details. And number two, their stories can be tailored to become a lot more enticing to the algorithm and garner shares and likes a lot faster due to the shocking nature of the story. Real journalism and real stories are plain and boring. Like, oh hey, those ballots in Wisconsin, yeah, it turns out they have nothing to do with the presidential election. So maybe the mail just fell out of a mail truck by accident. Oh well. Do you think anyone cares? Or will care about that? No. And before we move on to the hard question of what do we do about this so it doesn't happen again, I want to take some time and talk about the term echo chambers, which a lot of people use and attribute to the polarization that we're seeing on social media and in real life. It gets thrown around a lot, and I wanted to share some information about what we really mean when we say echo chamber. And I want to talk about it most of all because I read a great article by one of the people I quote most often on here, Zeynep Tufekci, and I think she goes more in depth about what echo chambers really are than most other people go. And it might help change your thinking on this subject. She says, the much touted issue of filter bubbles or echo chambers, the claim that online we encounter only views similar to our own. This isn't completely true. While algorithms will often feed people some of what they already want to hear, research shows that we probably encounter a wider variety of opinions online than we do offline. Rather, the problem is that when we encounter opposing views in the age and context of social media, it's not like reading them in a newspaper while sitting alone. It's like hearing them from the opposing team while sitting with our fellow fans in a football stadium. Online, we're connected with our communities and we seek approval from our like-minded peers. We bond with our team by yelling at the fans of the other one. In sociology terms, we strengthen our feeling of in-group belonging by increasing our distance from and tension with the outgroup, us versus them. Our cognitive universe isn't an echo chamber, but our social one is. This is why the various projects for fact-checking claims in the news, while valuable, don't convince people. Belonging is stronger than facts. End quote. I think that really cuts to the core what this is about at a psychological level, in terms of like, this is why social media polarizes us so much. Like, yeah, we know polarization happens, but she really goes deep down into saying why polarization happens. It's all tribal. It's all social. This is why things like masks have become a tribal issue. Like your team, anti-mask, or my team, pro-mask. Everything has to turn into a contest, and us versus them. Zeynep also wrote, in a different article, that masks have become a talisman of sorts, signaling your belonging in a tribe, rather than the public health tool that it's supposed to be. It's like wearing the hat of your favorite baseball team and walking around and seeing other people wearing the hats of their baseball team. And you're in the same tribe as the people with the same hat as you, and if someone's wearing a different hat, they're not in your tribe. Masks are now like that. Social media platforms have taken people's natural proclivity for organizing into groups and tribes and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar business. And it's so much easier to do digitally, where you can participate with a couple clicks of a button instead of having to march somewhere or meet up somewhere and carry a sign. People don't go on Twitter and Facebook for the news and opinions because they're interested in what happened. They go on so they can talk with other people about news and opinions and what happened. The news and opinions are just the icebreaker. They're just something to talk about so that you can make conversation with the other people on the platform. Belonging is stronger than facts. Okay, now let's answer the hard question. The hard question being, what do we do about this? What do we do to mitigate future spreads of misinformation and disinformation? Trying to come up with solutions to stem the spread of misinformation while avoiding the slippery slope issue of censorship and the private versus public ownership of social media platforms issue is something that a lot of people are discussing recently. And it all seems to come down to varying degrees of censorship and algorithmic nudging, and how much is the right amount of these two things. I feel like a lot of people know about the censorship issue, where they can hate Donald Trump but also dislike the fact that he was banned on Twitter and Facebook at the same time. Because free speech, right? But most people don't talk about the nudging towards outrage that's done by the algorithm because it's invisible and they don't think about it. But there's plenty of opinions about censorship. We have some people saying that tech platforms and the CEOs have too much power and we should just have no censorship or banning at all. And we have others who want more censorship because they think it will prevent the type of thing that happened at the Capitol. But they're worried that if that happens, all the people who have opinions that may get them banned on Twitter will move underground to a place like Parler where their organizing cannot be monitored. So would it be worth it to crack down on behavior and risk causing people to bring their unwanted views to a place in the shadows where it can fester? There's tons of opinions out there and a lot of angles to come at it from. In the same way that the Second Amendment text was and is extremely unsuitable for ruling on the lawfulness of weapons we have available to us today, things like rocket launchers, fully automatic machine guns, and nuclear weapons, the First Amendment text finds its usefulness fading away in the scope of, instead of new weapons, new platforms of speech that we didn't have in the 17 or 1800s, where there was no guidance or previous rule set explaining how to deal with this new technology. We're in the wild, wild west now, where we have to decide what the rules are as we move forward into unknown territory. It's up to government regulators working with the tech giants to create new rules and precedents for the future of the social media space. Going back to the Election Integrity Partnership, I found some parts of their key recommendations that I think might help. They advise having media platforms, quote, invest in research into the efficacy of internal policy interventions, such as labeling, and share those results with external researchers, civil society, and the public, unquote. And that basically sort of means like backing up your policy, like labeling misleading tweets, with statistics, or basically the good news that has come from you properly labeling misleading tweets and maybe banning certain people. Things like, the effectiveness of our hiding misleading tweets has led to a 27% decrease in outrage and circulation of fake news. And if you crunch the numbers, or have a third-party research organization crunch the numbers, people will be like, damn, 27%, that's a lot. now I realize that there's a good reason that they're labeling tweets. It's actually helping. Just share with us the reason why you're labeling tweets. Share with us how helpful it is in curtailing the outrage and the disinformation. Another recommendation they make is to impose clear consequences for accounts that repeatedly violate platform policies. Even for someone like, the president? Have everyone be treated equally. It's that simple. If you post fake news an X number of times, that's a strike. And 3 strikes, you're out. There needs to be legitimate guidelines created that people can refer to for proof that you aren't biased. By you, I mean Twitter. For proof that Twitter isn't biased when they ban people or when they label what they label and do what they do. Transparency. Because otherwise, as it looks now, people seem to get banned because they cross some arbitrary line that they don't see or know the boundaries of. Transparency is one of the core policies that the EIP report mentions that tech platforms could improve upon. And another great idea that I found, there was an article published in Nature in March 2021 that I'll put in the description that argues, after polling and finding out that even though people value accuracy of stories highly, that distraction is the problem. That the likes, retweets, and followers' motivation behind social media, aka the incentives, which I've talked about before, often overshadows the motive to get the truth. People just think about how many impressions and engagements they might get instead of thinking about how accurate the article is. It may really be that simple. In this study, there were groups that were assigned a specific task of evaluating the accuracy of an article before being asked how likely they are to share it. Those groups reduced their likelihood of sharing false news stories by 50% compared to groups that were not primed to think about accuracy before being asked if they would share the story. So that could be another possible solution. Priming people, and I'll get into that in a second, priming people to just think, just tell them in one sentence, hey, maybe you should think about the accuracy of the article you're about to click on from this tweet. Because that's not what people are thinking about when they click it. Their minds are in social media incentives mode. How can I score points with my tribe mode? So this research suggests that people aren't really doing this on purpose, or at least most people aren't. Or at least most common people with not that many followers aren't. And getting back to the word prime, that reminds me of the words nudge and friction that are used in the social media landscape. They all accomplish more or less the same thing: to steer our attention, control a bit more tightly what we see, and therefore alter the angle at which we view information, changing how we think about what we see. Primes and nudges work by tweaking the algorithm or site rules so we are more likely to see certain posts or information, and friction works in the opposite way by reducing that exposure and hiding it from more people. And friction, at least to me, seems just as effective as priming and nudging, because the absence of something that would have changed somebody's mind is just as effective as the exposure to something that does. And there's been a recent change made by Facebook that seems promising that has to do with friction. Facebook said it's changing the way it recommends groups and will limit the reach of those that break its rules. And to me, this is just Facebook fighting back against its own algorithm and its own app and website design. Under the new rules, which will apply to its tens of millions of active groups, Facebook will show rule-breaking groups lower in the recommendations bar, making them less discoverable to other users. Friction. This is Facebook fighting back against its own recommendation algorithm because it has ultimately led to the organization of real-world violence. The idea that these places are neutral and should continue to stay neutral by not banning or labeling anyone is short-sighted. The algorithm makes certain that this isn't a neutral space. Your recommended groups and your most recommended posts and tweets at the top of your page, those being at the top of the page themselves over a chronological order is itself not neutral. Here's a quote from Renee DiResta. Weightings in curation and tweaks to virality algorithms have been happening for a decade. There is no neutral ranking short of reverse chronological order, and that is a garbage user experience. There is no pure neutral state. End quote. Supposedly, these new group rules will be rolled out over the next few months in 2021, and this makes me happy to see some semblance of progress, and I look forward to seeing how it goes. Facebook always seemed like the most shadowy social media platform to me, or shady, I should say. So hearing this is music to my ears. I think the social media platforms or CEOs get a bad rap that they're encouraging this type of behavior because they're not banning enough people or they're not tuning their algorithm enough. And I was happy to see that in the election integrity report that the response rate to misinformation tickets that were sent from the EIP to workers from platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google, the response rate was extremely high. 76% of tickets were responded to by Facebook, 84% by Twitter, 89% by Google, and surprisingly to me, 90% by TikTok, which I've never used because I guess I'm old now. Overall, the media platforms took action on 35% of the URLs that were reported to them by the EIP. 21% of that 35% were labeled, like, this tweet may be misleading. 13% were removed entirely, and 1% were soft blocked, which I won't get into, but don't worry about it. You can Google it. This shows to me that these platforms definitely are keeping their ear close to the ground for these things. And there's even more proof that these platforms aren't just sitting back and doing nothing. Twitter introduced labeling of tweets about the election in September 2020 and reduced the visibility of those tweets. They added context to the trending section, which is why you see text under the hashtags before you actually have to click or press on the hashtag and see all the posts. And they removed the liked by and followed by recommendations. They did that in October 2020. After the election, they started to link to official election result websites on some tweets that make claims about the results. And this is just Twitter. The other platforms did their own work, and I'll link to a nice timeline from the EIP that showcases what each platform did with their policy to curb mis and disinformation. So yeah, I'm glad to see more friction and nudging being added in a thoughtful and sensible way, because these things can be abused by bad actors. So after hearing the story about Facebook applying friction to its rule-breaking groups and lowering them in the recommendations bar, let's talk about another example, but this time of nudging or priming. So instead of the absence of something, the exposure to something that will change people's minds and change outcomes. I will link to the website in the description, but there's something called the redirect method, which uses existing advertisement methods. So things like every time you see a YouTube ad or a Facebook ad or a Twitter ad. So in the redirect method, instead of showing you an ad telling you how tasty Doritos are, it targets people who are most likely to fall for ISIS propaganda and serves ads to persuade them into watching anti-ISIS propaganda. And it works. But it can easily be done in reverse, and by anyone. Facebook, Google, these companies provide you with the data. Well, not the data, they provide you with the target audience that you're looking for. So you can just say, I want to target people who are susceptible to ISIS propaganda. And that will work. Your ads will be targeted towards these people. And if you read about this in further detail, and I'll explain a little more detail about this redirect method, it reminds me of something Yuval Noah Harari has said about the book Brave New World. He said something along the lines of, when you read Brave New World, you get a sense that the world the author is describing is dystopian, yet you can't quite put a finger on why it is worse than what our current reality is like. And I feel the same way about this redirect method. They reached over 320,000 people in what can only be seen as a valiant effort to stem the promotion of ISIS recruitment and propaganda. Yet just reading about how it was done and realizing that something like this is possible, nudging people into differing opinions by targeting ads towards those who are most susceptible to ISIS propaganda, I really recommend you read how this was done. The link to their website gloating about this, which I guess they should, is in the description. And if you understand how this was done, you understand that in order to target people who are most susceptible to ISIS propaganda, YouTube has to have been collecting data on viewing history and habits. It all feels very cold and machine-like, and that's because it is. The fact that some lines of code can figure out what's important to you and micro-target you in order to change your opinions on whatever topic it desires can be hard to come to terms with. It makes us feel like we're not in control, like we are easily manipulated, like we don't really make our own choices, but base them on whatever happens to be in front of us at the time and our past experiences. I mean, it's one thing to be shown ads for running shoes all day, which is what I get, and be okay with it and happy with it, and it's another to be swayed against carrying out a terrorist attack by micro-targeting that is done by a system that knows that you're closer to becoming a terrorist than you know. It knows more about you than you know about yourself. After saying all this, you might think I would be against this type of nudging, or to put it nicely, behavioral intervention, or not so nicely, behavioral manipulation. But honestly, I don't think it is inherently bad. It depends on what you use it for, like the redirect method, using it to spread anti-ISIS propaganda. So, we need to keep this superpower in good hands. And it is a superpower. This is what Big Brother in 1984 would only dream of having. This is the ability to decide what people like and dislike, and what people actually think is the truth, on a global scale. They're not just saying we're at war with Eurasia because that's what Big Brother wants to hear. They believe it. That's a superpower. So let me go over why I'm pro nudging and friction, and therefore in some way pro censorship. Even after talking about how dystopian it feels. I mean, there has to be some form of censorship in order to fix these problems that we have on social media. There already is censorship. And the only way we're going to change the state of the discourse on social media is to change the algorithm, or change nudging and friction, or outright manually label and ban people. All of these are a form of manipulation and changing what people think and do away from what they otherwise would have done, which to me is kind of under the umbrella of censorship. Let's begin by talking about censorship we can all agree on, and see if you can decide, if it was all up to you, where you would draw the line on the so-called slippery slope. So, what is censorship that we could all possibly agree on? Child pornography. There's automatic detection and deletion of child pornography on every social media platform that Americans use. And there's also a growing database of terrorist content that is looking to be scrubbed off these platforms in the same way that CP is. So if you say you're anti-censorship and you're pro-free speech, is child pornography something you're thinking about and making an exception for? I myself learned about this recently, of the automatic detection and deletion of it, and I assume most people don't know that this happens. But there's what's called a CSAM database that every social media platform uses. CSAM meaning Child Sexual Abuse Material. Here's a quote from Evelyn Doweck in her article about the rise of content cartels. Despite the legendary ruthless competitiveness of Silicon Valley, platforms have long cooperated on the removal of child sexual abuse material. Researcher Hani Farid and Microsoft developed a digital fingerprinting technology called PhotoDNA in 2009. This technology allows images to be hashed and added to databases run by non-profits such as the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children and the UK-based Internet Watch Foundation. Companies can then use these databases to automatically and preemptively prevent copies of included images from being uploaded to their services. Facebook deployed PhotoDNA in 2010 Twitter in 2011, and Google in 2016. There has been concerns, but in general, because the harm of CSAM is so great, the category of content so specific, and the agreement on both of these factors effectively universal, this cooperation between law enforcement, civil society, and the major internet giants is seen as an important institutional innovation to combat the explosion in CSAM caused by the internet. Danielle Citron has memorably coined this evolution censorship creep to describe how a tool like PhotoDNA, intended to help execute one type of speech regulation, the removal of CSAM, comes to be used for others, such as terrorist content. End quote. So in this paragraph, she explains why and how PhotoDNA was created, and that there's now technology already developed to identify terrorist content and scrub terrorist content the same way it scrubs CSAM content. So after hearing about that, what do you think about that? I think we can all agree there's some amount of censorship that needs to be required. I don't think Parler wants any of this stuff on their website either. There's not much polarization to be found about this, which is a relief. I read an article recently by someone who I'm a big fan of, Fredrik deBoer. I admire him and enjoy reading everything he puts out, including an article he wrote about censorship that I disagree with, but I think gives a good counter-argument to my opinion. I think the conclusion that he comes to is that you can't censor away extremism. So that's why there's no point in censoring anyone. And not only that, but it's counterintuitive to censor, because it only makes the extremism worse. And I think that you can censor away extremism. That's not to say that censorship is a good thing or a bad thing, just that I think it's possible. The book 1984 didn't have such a happy ending. Big Brother's censorship worked. Of course, 1984 is fiction, but China's internet censorship is real, and it works. It depends on what you're censoring, doesn't it? The reason censorship is bad in 1984 and in China is because they censor the truth. They block access to certain information, and they try to keep you in the dark. But if you're not censoring the truth from people, and you're trying to censor bad actors and people who are spouting misinformation and disinformation, it becomes hard to decide if that is the morally right thing to do. It's easy for everyone to say that Big Brother in 1984 is something nobody ever wants to see happen in real life, but it's hard to say that Big Twitter shouldn't censor the president because he's a complete lunatic who advocates violence. Twitter's not the one saying that we've always been at war with East Asia, and then 2 days later saying we've always been at war with Eurasia. Donald Trump is the one saying those things, and Twitter banned him. So in his defense against censorship, deBoer writes, "Racism isn't shrinking, it's growing." And he says, "The Holocaust denial that I mentioned is illegal in Germany. Well, they're stepping up efforts to shut it down, which might seem encouraging until you realize that people only step up efforts to shut something down when it's been on the rise. So he's using the fact that present day racism seems to be growing and Holocaust denial is growing because the efforts to shut it down is rising, and that these things are evidence for the fact that the current censorship of racists and Holocaust deniers is not working. And I would say, could there be another reason why these things are growing, though? The rise of social media could be causing things like this big opposition or racist or Nazi party, and censorship may be the thing slowing it down. Correlation does not imply causation. The platforms themselves just existing and having everyone have a lower barrier to entry of creating tribes and groups, that's what I think is causing an uptick in racism and Holocaust denial. People's minds are being changed, and we're all getting exposed more to what people think than we used to. So of course, in a town of 10 million people, there's going to be more Nazis than in a town of 5,000. You have no idea what would happen if you could turn back time and decide that Germany had no censorship at all. You don't know what that Germany would look like. There could be less Holocaust deniers roaming around, but there could also be more. And then he goes on to use present-day France as an example as well. He says the National Front, or Rally Party, the gold standard of genteel European proto-fascism, got 3 million votes in the first round of the National Assembly elections in 2017. Good for 13% of the vote. In the presidential election, they got more than 7.5 million votes. Good for second place. So, apparently fascism is on the rise in France in the current day, and that is supposedly evidence that censorship doesn't work. And I would just say that European countries have different immigration policies, different racial makeups, different population densities, and you cannot compare their rise of fascism and censorship to other countries around the world with different racial compositions and immigration policies. Take a look at anti-maskers. Have we been censoring anti-maskers? Not really. Where are we with them? It seems like whether something is heavily censored or not doesn't have the biggest effect on whether its mantle is picked up by a large number of people. And I guess the equivalent of censoring here would be the enforcement of it, the penalty of throwing someone in jail for not wearing it. And we're not really doing that. You know, the worst we get is kicking someone out of a store or publicly humiliating them in a viral TikTok video. So there hasn't really been heavy enforcement of a mask. And I guess that's sort of an opinion, and you might disagree, that there has been heavy enforcement by private businesses that won't let you into their store or restaurant if you're not wearing one. And if you think that, then let me just say, do you think that there would be more people wearing masks and willing to wear them if the rules were more relaxed and businesses did let in people who weren't wearing one? Do you think more people would wear them? And I know censoring speech and penalizing someone for not wearing a mask are different things, but I do think the comparison between them and the point I'm trying to get across does work, where if you relax on the rules that you think somehow less people will become Nazis if you allow Nazis to try and convert people. And more people will wear masks if you relax the restrictions on mask wearing. Like, yeah, I'm sure there are some people who hate being told what to do, and so therefore they don't wear a mask specifically because society and businesses tell them they should. But I guarantee you at least 90% of people who don't wear one inside a business do it because they don't think it works. And that over 90% of Nazis aren't Nazis because they're being kicked off social media platforms for their views. And they think it's forbidden knowledge. And that they're the ones that know the secret that other people don't, and it's trying to be suppressed. At least 90% of them are Nazis because they agree with the ideology, and they think that's the way the world should work. They're not fascists because other people tell them they can't be. And here's more from deBoer. What you can do is to mitigate the negative effects of hate as best you can by empowering targeted groups and by trying to present a more compelling and attractive vision than the fascists. But that's wild, unrealistic stuff. Instead, you should try to stamp out extremism and hate with censorship when every attempt to do so has failed in the history of the world. Cool. Try to make people see why you're right and the other side is wrong? That's too crazy to contemplate. End quote. I read stuff like that a lot, and it's just like living in a fantasy world. Saying things like, try to convince them fascism is bad and the better ideas will win, is usually said by people who assume the social media platforms are neutral or forget that not everybody sees the same content they do. The algorithm is ever at play here as well. It's hard to even think of a way to make a truly neutral platform. Even when misleading tweets are hidden, that just makes some people believe in them even more. The playing field is not level. The team that yells the loudest or abuses the system the most gets an advantage, whether you're a fascist or not. It didn't take a good argument to convince people that slaves were bad for us to get rid of slaves. It took a president with power to do it, and a literal war. A great real-life experiment to test that present a more compelling and attractive vision argument that we have running in the present day is vax versus anti-vax sentiment. Should we censor or should we try and convince them pro-vaccine is the way to go? I think this is a wonderful example to use because it mirrors political movements and conspiracy theories as well. It has effects on other people. It's not just someone's choice, and you're siloed off from everyone else. The choices we make in the free speech versus censorship battle affects everybody, and the choices we make letting anti-vaxxers spout their anti-vaxxing stuff also affects everybody. If we can't convince people that vaccines are safe and effective, maybe it is too hard to convince people that fascism is bad. This anti-vax garbage is growing in popularity as our science and technology has gotten more and more effective. The data showing how good vaccines are has never been more well laid out and methodical. The history books of the world have never been more well written and accurate. People have never had more knowledge available at their fingertips, and more opinions available at their fingertips. Yet here we are, The problem to me is not a lack of information or a lack of a good argument against fascism or for vaccines. The tools to convince people what is true and what is good have never been better. The problem is the tools to convince people what is false has also never been better. The problem is the social media platforms themselves, the way people interact, the order of the content that's presented by the algorithm. Belonging is more important than facts. To me, that is what is causing rising fascism in the first place. If your solution to that is to leave that algorithm alone and try to convince people that Nazis are bad or vaccines are good, you may be fighting an uphill battle forever if you don't tackle the root cause of why people believe what they believe in the first place. It's not censorship. In conclusion, I gained more trust for the people running social media platforms than I already had after doing this research and after reading the Election Integrity Partnership report, which I would definitely recommend you read at least the executive summary of. The platforms themselves are of course having terrible effects, but the people running them didn't intend for this and are trying to make things better. Sometimes I remind myself, probably to confirm my own bias, that the people who work at these companies like Google and Facebook are some of the smartest people on the planet, and a lot of them are young and care about their community and the world around them. This isn't a shadowy government. These are trillion-dollar companies with the best talent and ways of working through problems that any other company or group of people would be happy to match. There's plenty of stories to be found about the workers within these companies bringing up issues with their managers and the higher-ups, issues that they care about, that they're passionate about justice and good causes. These are fierce, strong, intelligent people who get treated very well and who aren't afraid to speak up. Working in tech, they're most likely very online individuals that are in touch with the friction between social media and the effects it had on creating the Capitol riots, among the other terrible behaviors it brings out in people. Have you ever come across a news article or a post that had to do with something you're very knowledgeable about? I think most of us have, at least once. And when that happened, did you think the article wasn't as good as it could be? Or maybe it was missing some vital information or framing things in a way that you wouldn't approve of? You know your field very well, or your hobby very well. Well, it goes both ways. It's not just you that's doing that. The people working on these social media misinformation problems know their field too. They know what's going on more than you do, if it's not your field. And they have a lot more information and insight at their disposal to decide the best way to fix these problems than you too. You can keep holding these companies' feet to the fire. I think that's a healthy thing to do. But these thousands of employees are not all in cahoots to create policy that bans conservatives for no reason. They are also not in cahoots to shield the centrists and military-industrial complex that some progressives might think they do. Let them do work, and especially let them collaborate with organizations like the Stanford Internet Observatory and Graphica and other cybersecurity researchers who know their stuff. And if we do that, then we just may be able to get through this. All right. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.